Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be painting a Space Marine. It's a Desolation Space Marine from the Strike Force Agastus box that Games Workshop sent me, and I'm going to be painting it as a Dark Angel. I'm also going to be using the new Vallejo game colour paints to paint it, and also a few of the toothing coats paints for the metallic areas. But generally speaking, I'm going to be testing out the new colours to see how they work. One thing I would like to note about these is that they're called game colour, and Vallejo already had the game colour range. These are nothing like the previous game colour range, and I'm not entirely sure why they've been called game colour, because they're it's almost like they're designed for pro painters. They're incredibly matte. I mean, they're so matte you could wipe your feet on them when you're walking through your front door. You'll kind of see that a little bit in the video as we go through. So they give a very, very different finish to the previous game colour, and they're quite different to work with as well. Having said that, I mean, I really like them. I'm just not sure how suitable they are actually for gaming pieces if you want to play them, because they're so matte. They're not going to be quite as hard wearing, and like the properties of them are really just seem to me anyway to be designed for sort of like display level painting. But anyway, we're going to see how I get on with them as we go through. To start with, I'm using Angel Green, which I guess is kind of like suitable. Presumably is sort of like a rip-off of like a Dark Angel green colour. I have mixed the some of the colours. So if you look in the top left there, so there's 5 colours on the wet palette. Don't worry too much about the top 2 for the time being. What I did to start with was take some of the Angel Green and the charcoal, and I mixed that roughly 50-50, but I mean it's up to you really, and then just covered the whole model with it with kind of like a large dry brush. That's an Artis Opus it's some sort of size of Artis Opus dry brush, I can't remember, but like any kind of large sort of makeup brush or whatever will do, and I just sort of like stippled it all over. So I do water it down as well, so it's not straight from the pot. It is something to bear in mind that if you're going to use a brush like this, that you do need to water the paints down a bit, because you will otherwise get sort of like a textured effect. And I don't mean texture like a painted on texture, I mean like in a 3-dimensional texture, like bumps basically on the model. So it would look a bit messy, like the paint will be too thick, so you do have to water it down a little bit, just so it sort of looks smooth when you apply it, so not so thin that it just ends up just running everywhere. So you can see as I stipple the paint on, it does stay where I put it, but it's still quite thin. So I mean, you probably want to go around about 50-50 water to paint, but test it yourself just to see what sort of results you'll get. And then after that had dried, and what I'm actually applying now in the video, because I'm a little bit behind, but this is just the straight Angel Green, so you can see on the wet palette that's in the bottom left there, and you can see also on the main screen I'm using some kitchen roll. Because the paint is watered down a little bit, I dip the brush into the paint and then I dab it onto the kitchen roll just to take off the excess, because what will happen is if you take that straight from the wet palette and put it onto the model, it's too much paint. It'll just sort of flood the area. Again, because it's sort of watered down. When you're applying the Angel Green, it is more a case of being a very little bit careful in how you're applying it. Like I'm not too bothered. You're going to catch other parts of the model with it. So if you catch the gun, I mean the gun is quite large. I know a few people have mentioned how big the weapons are on these Marines. It's kind of like fun. I mean, just to mention actually about the gun, I have cut the flap that covers the rocket, just to make it look a little bit cleaner. But apart from that, it's a fairly standard model. But yeah, as you're painting it, stippling it on and things, there's a good chance you're going to catch all the different parts of the model, and really don't worry too much about that. But it is kind of more of a case of trying to block in the sort of light, where you want the light to fall on the model, because I'm painting this with sort of light volumes, and that just means like sort of filling in the armour where the light will hit it. Whereas, as opposed to if you're painting it sort of like an heavy metal style, then you're picking up more of the edges. So on this, I'm picking up more of this sort of like the flat surfaces of the armour. And as it dries there, so this is quite interesting. If you compared that image that you see on screen there to the previous image where I was applying the paint, you see there's a vast difference in how it looks, and that's purely down to how matte the paint is. And it is something that you have to be kind of aware of, especially if you're painting over like a satin finish. So which generally is what the primers will look like when you've painted that. So, and I'm using the black of the primer as a base. If you want the whole model to be matte, then you either give the whole model a matte varnish before you start painting it, or you can just use give it the coat of the Vallejo black as well, because like all of these new game color paints are matte. So I mean, it's up to you. I just couldn't be bothered, but I am going to do some washes over the top of it with some contrast paints as well, although I'm not sure how useful that is. I mean, you will see why I do it, but you can probably get away with skipping it. It just gives quite a subtle effect. At the minute, you can see I'm also using some of the Two Thin Coats metallic paint. I hadn't tried any of the metallics yet from those, so I thought I'd just throw those in to have a quick bash with them. They're quite nice. You can see in the well palette that I've got there in the top left where I've put it, put some paint in there. I didn't thin it. I just wanted to see how it would flow straight from the pot. I don't recommend you do this but I just wanted to see, what sort of consistency they would work with straight from the pot. Thin it basically, add some water to it. So here you can see at the bottom I had carried on painting the rest of all the metallic areas with the paint thinned. It just flows a lot better, but the coverage is still good. So they're pretty good for metallics there, and you can see I'm using the gold as well. And I missed what colour I just put up on the screen, but I think there's only 2 gold colours. I mean, it'll all be in the description anyway for which gold it is. And again, this works quite well. Covers nicely, and does what I want from a metallic paint, which isn't usually a lot because I don't like using metallic paints, but I know people do tend to, especially for gaming purposes, prefer true metals, so I thought I'd give them a go anyway for this. So at this stage you've got something that's like, very basically filled in, but it's got some nice light volumes on the armour, green, metal and gold. So now I'm going to paint in the red on the gun. Now, I wasn't super impressed with the reds from this. They seemed, I don't know, they didn't seem to cover as well as I thought they would. The green that I put on, the angel green, that covered really nicely. It had a really nice matte finish and things like that. I'd already tried one of the model colour, I think it was Evil Red it was called, on a Khorne Lord on Juggernaut, the recent one that came out, and I really didn't get on with that either. It was quite dark and didn't make a big impact on the model when I applied it. And I've kind of found the same thing with the reds here as well. I'm trying to find where it is so I can tell you what the name of it was. I can't find it to hand, but again, it'll be in the description. But the other red here is Scarlet Red as well. So there's 2 reds on there, and it was a big tonal jump between the 2. So I had a little mix of them together in between. And the Scarlet Red was quite nice actually, and you can see as that applies, it covers pretty well. I would say that because these are all matte though, you do tend to see the brush marks a little bit more easily. It is one of the kind of negatives about using very matte paint, is that especially if the area beneath it is slightly satin, when you apply the matte, for a start off it looks fine, but as it dries, like, you get a very distinct difference between the brush mark that you've made and the primer underneath it. So you basically have to cover all of the primer, whereas I kind of got into the habit of painting models, with Vallejo model color and also the Games Workshop paint. So those have a slightly satin finish, like not too much. Games Workshop slightly more satin, but it does vary paint by paint anyway. And because of the finish is closer to that of the primer, you don't notice the difference, like when you apply the mark. Obviously when it's wet it looks fine, but then as it dries you see how the light reflects off of it, and the matte paint is very, very obvious in comparison. But it's not really that big an issue. If you paint the model properly, you get enough layers of paint on, or also you just give it a varnish at the end. Quite often I will give a model a whole coat of matte varnish, just to even all the surfaces out, so it wouldn't be an issue like that. It just can be a bit irritating while you're painting it, just because you have to sort of visualize how it's going to look, rather than it just being blended all together, having blended between the the primer and the layer on top, so that they don't stand out too separately. So you saw the two reds blended on there. They weren't too bad. Like I said, the Scarlet blood was a little bit better, and it's a really nice color as well, actually. But I did find really that I kind of preferred Games Workshop red colors a little bit. I mean, to be fair, I think the reds are some of the best colors in Games Workshop's range, and some of the other colors are a bit sort of rubbishy. But I did feel that the reds in general were a little bit weaker from the game color. But they'll get the job done anyway. And if you want to have like a very matte model overall, or you just want to use matte paints, then obviously stick. The Vallejo are very consistent all over for the finish that you get. It's not like you get some paints that are going to be shiny and some that are going to be matte or anything like that. It is a case that they all have like an equal level of matte to them. You can see there I also very quickly used the charcoal colour just to block in some of the highlights on the weapon, where I want the light to fall on it, and I did those in a kind of a scratchy method as well, just to so the idea with the scratchy method is that it sort of gives a textured effect, the same as the armor panels, but because you have a smaller area to work with, you're having to get your brush right in there, and it's not a good idea to do that once you've already painted some of the other areas on the model, because if you're using a dry brush doing that stippling effect, as you saw when I was doing the green, you are going to get some of that charcoal highlight on the sort of metallic elements and the red areas and things like that. So in that case, the style of painting, the scratchy sort of style of painting, still gives a textured finish. It takes a tiny bit longer, but you can be a bit lazy with it. It's not got to be perfect. And here I'm doing my favourite contrast method of just slapping it straight out of the pot onto the model, and then having some of the contrast medium in the well palette. I know Peachy tried this method. He'd taken the technique that I used from an Imperial Fist Space Marine, because he was testing out some different ways of painting yellow, and he was curious why I use it from the pot and then add the contrast medium afterwards. And the reason for it is it gives me more control over how strong the contrast medium is on different parts of the model. So I only really put the contrast medium on the sort of shoulders and chest and head area, and the rest it leaves fairly dark, or any area of the model that I don't want to have too much contrast paint on. It just allows me to sort of dilute the color a little bit, but at the same time, it's probably more finicky than it needs to be. If you just wanted to thin it all at once and cover the model and not worry about it too much, you probably can get away with doing that as well. But me being me, I just like to spend a little bit longer messing around with paints. But the other thing that you have to do when you sort of like slap all that contrast on the model is that you have to, and it is important, and you apply it, you do use a large brush. So I'm using a size 4 Artis Opus brush there, but you have to make sure that you take off any excess in sort of like the recess areas, because contrast medium does dry a little bit thicker than you expect, because it looks sort of like a wash, like Agrax Earthshade or whatever, but it dries thicker than those. So if you have an excess in the recesses, it sort of fills in the detail. So make sure you go around with the brush and just take off any sort of pooling before it actually dries. And now I've gone on to Nuln Oil. So kind of interestingly, kind of ignore the knee pad a little bit there. Actually, I just did a test on that just to see what the highlights and things look like, because I hadn't used these paints before. I kind of wanted to get an idea where I was going with it before actually recording it. But for the metallics here, so obviously they're already sort of browned in a little bit with the contrast Darkoath flesh, but now I'm just putting some Nuln Oil in just to darken some areas. So you're not covering all of the metallics, but just getting it in sort of the darker areas, or to create a bit of contrast and things. It's still sort of a kind of a lazy way of doing it, and I'm really not spending much time on the metallics at all. For the chest piece, I did this in the wrong order. Well, it's not the wrong order. Like, you'll get the same effect if you do it how I'm doing it here. But I was going to do it so that I applied the blue color, which is it's turquoise, obviously. I mean, I thought it might have a fantasy name, but it's just called turquoise on the pot. The idea is that you're supposed to apply that before you put the wash on top, because then it makes it look grimy as well as having the verdigris on there. But if you're happy with how it looks on this, then do it in this order. But it's the turquoise paint, and you just thin it down quite a lot, around about 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and you just sort of flood the area. Just be a little bit careful. If you see how when I applied it, I did it a little bit too excessive, and it sort of got down onto the chest area. So try and avoid that. Do maybe 2 coats. I do actually end up adding a few extra coats later on off screen, so if you want a stronger verdigris effect, and just in case you're wondering, you don't know the word verdigris, it's just the sort of weathering that happens to like bronze and copper and stuff like that. It's the copper element in them, and it's kind of like, it's basically green rust, if you like. But that's that done. Now the main part of the model, and the bit that most people will find sort of interesting on it, is the armor. So this is where I'm actually going to go back and show you how to do this sort of like the shiny textured effect. So we're going back with the angel color, angel green, and I'm also using toxic yellow. So toxic yellow will be the equivalent of ice yellow or dawn yellow if you're using Games Workshop paints. So if you look on the wet palette on the left hand side, so there's the 3 greens. The bottom left green is just straight angel green. Above that it's around about 50-50, and above that it's majority toxic yellow with a small amount of green, and then to the right of that is pure toxic yellow. Don't worry too much about the toxic yellow, and even the majority toxic yellow mixed with angel green, you're going to be quite sparse with how you apply that. That's only for the very final sort of highlights. But the main thing is the first stage highlight, which is around about 50-50. But what happens is, when you test it and you apply it to the model and you find that the mark looks too strong, do additional mixes. So I've got away with just using those 3 mixes of green, but if you find that the marks that you're making just stand out too much, do additional mixes, so some that are lighter, some that are darker, because as you do the layers on top, successive layers, you will find it's easy to get a transition on there. I've had a lot of practice using this sort of scratchy method, so I can use my technique to overcome the difficulties in the having big jumps in tonal contrast between each layer. But like, if you sort of struggle a little bit with using the technique, then having more mixes will just help you make that sort of blended look. The technique itself is, it's fairly straightforward, but it's more of a case of brush control. which is very similar like to edge highlighting as well. Like, it's a very simple technique, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. All I'm doing is adding a small amount of paint to the tip of the brush, then I rub it off on my thumb, or you can use whatever if you don't want to put it on your thumb, you know, a tile or even spare area on the wet palette, but just to get it off the excess so that the tip of the brush is very sharp. And then all you're doing is, when you're painting it, if you can see, I'm just only touching the very tip of the brush onto the model, so it's very delicate, the connection point. If you push too hard, you'll make a much bigger mark, so obviously more paint will come off from the brush as well, but it will bend the tip over so you have a larger surface area. But the major negative of, you know, if you push too hard is that it doesn't make the tiny little marks. So that's what you're really aiming for, lots and lots of tiny little marks. And, you know, one or two of them, even if you go wrong a little bit or you put them in the wrong place, it doesn't matter. You just turn them into scratches and things. But because they're so small, they just fill the area nicely. So it's quite a sort of laid back way of painting. You don't have to be super precise, as long as you get the general kind of look. And what you'll find is as well, when you first start applying it, there's areas that are going to be missed a bit, looks a little bit sort of patchy. It's very easy just to go back and go over those until you get sort of a roughly even surface. Now, you can spend as long doing this as you want, and you can actually do very smooth blends using this technique, but it will take a long time and a bit of practice. Don't try straight away and do something like this for the Golden Demon if you've never done it before, because chances are it won't be quite as smooth and clean as you want it to be. But with a bit of practice, make sure the paint's thinned enough. So, you know, you always have to thin these. What you'll find as well is, as you keep going, the paint dries on the wet palette. Even like small differences can make small changes in how wet the paint is can make a big difference in how what the mark looks like as you apply it to the model. So just keep an eye on that, because the drier the paint is on the wet palette, the quicker it's going to dry on your brush. So the faster you have to move to get it onto the model. So it sort of exponentially speeds up the drying process for just a small amount of dryness on the wet palette. And especially if you live in a hot environment, then you're really going to struggle maybe with this technique if your paint is not wet enough on the wet palette. But it kind of, so the technique itself, it works very similar to stippling. And if you didn't want to do sort of like the sketchy kind of scratches that I put on, you can actually do stippling instead. It might take a little bit longer, but you can also combine the effects as well. So you can do the scratchy look and stippling at the same time. And so what the reason for that would be is, and especially if you're stippling and you want to thin the paint down some more, because then so it's kind of like micro stippling with very thin layers of paint, and you can use that to get very smooth transitions as well, and that can fill in any areas that look a little bit kind of patchy as well. And I mean, if you get to a stage and you're sort of like fed up of doing all the scratchy marks and it still looks a little bit harsh on there, then you can glaze over the top of it. So there's like lots and lots of techniques that you can combine together to get sort of the finish you want. Now, the way that I'm painting this is, so it's a bit of a Frankenstein's monster, really. So really this technique should be reserved more for sort of, leaders in the army maybe, or more like a display level sort of painting. It's going to take you a while to paint an army in this method, but for me, I'm more concerned about painting things the way I like to paint them. It's not about getting an army out quickly. Like, sometimes I'll do videos showing how you can do that, but my sort of passion is, the painting element and painting things nicely. Sometimes it's quicker, sometimes it's slower, but it's still more about the painting. And so, in that regard, this technique, it probably isn't ideal for you if you are purely wanting to get a model out or like an army out quickly. But if you check out some of my other videos, so I've done like Ultramarines and Blood Angels and things like that, where you get sort of quite a similar result to this, but without having to spend ages putting all this, carefully placed texture detail on the model. The main thing that makes this work is the light volumes. So I'm also adding in a few edge highlights, but they're sort of very sloppy and quick, and it's more they combine with the light volume placement. So if you look on the shoulder, say, where I've painted that sort of kind of circular looking specular highlight, on the curve, the shiny dot, and then it's got the trim next to it. You see, like I've painted in line with that. It fills in some of the highlight there, but not all the way around on the trim. And then I've gone further away, sort of like done scratchy marks just to fill in the area a bit. It works great, these sort of texture effect, just to fill in an area roughly without having to do like a clean, smooth transition. But if you look sort of around those areas, I have picked out a few edges just to help define it a little bit, because that's the main benefit of heavy metal style edge highlighting, is it really defines all the shapes on the model. Whereas if you only paint light volumes, you can get some really nice highlights and things, but a lot of the detail and shape of the model can actually get lost. So edge highlights are important, but you don't have to go over the top with it, because you're actually relying on the light volumes to fill in the model, if you like. When trying to figure out where to put the highlights, this is the main thing that people struggle with for making it look correct. It's probably the main thing that I get questions about, is that and it's linked very strongly, because it's the same thing, to non-metallic metal. And I know people complain about non-metallic metal, but this is basically non-metallic metal, but with like a not metal material that I'm trying to replicate. So it's just like a shiny power armor, but the whole principle is exactly the same. And that's the confusing part that people get when trying to paint non-metallics. And as I said, this is the same thing. It's not knowing where to place the highlights. And so I've mentioned this in previous videos as well. The primary way to get the main highlight placement on the model, the easiest way, is to just hold the model under a lamp and see how light falls on it. It gives you a really good idea of where to place highlights. What it doesn't give you an idea of is the size of the highlights, or where to put additional highlights, like bounce highlights, secondary reflections and things like that. But the thing with secondary reflections and bounce highlights and all that kind of thing is you just make them up. And that's one of the things with when people talk about this kind of painting, looking at it from multiple angles. The way to paint it when look for different angles is exactly the same that you've just done here. Like, you just rotate the model, paint that sort of angle, rotate it again, paint that sort of angle. So you're just putting little shine spots, and I will get to that in a moment when I show you how to do a few on like the shoulder pad and things for putting in additional shine spots. And they're actually quite nice, because you can see them from the front, these extra shine spots, and it just looks like separate reflections all the way around the model. So it looks quite nice, but it does take quite a bit longer to paint. You did see at one point there, when I'm painting these greens on, I will go backwards and forwards between the colours. There is actually one more green that I didn't mention, and so there's the three on the left there, but there's actually one in the bottom middle, and that was the angel green, and that's mixed with charcoal for a shade colour. And that's purely just to mix in any of the areas. Like, if I want an area to be a little bit darker, I just blend it in, but it's painted in exactly the same way. But the thing that I wanted to talk about was the glazing. So I'll go back in with the angel green, and if you look on the far right of the wet palette there is angel green again. So it's exactly the same colour, and it's just watered down more. So around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. But again, just test it to see what sort of results you'll get. Some people might prefer it a little bit thicker, other people might prefer it a little bit thinner, and the reason for that is if it's thinner, you're not going to be able to see that much of a difference, but you have a lot more control over it. And if you do multiple layers of very thin glazes, you'll get a very smooth, clean finish. Whereas if you do it a bit thicker, you'll much more quickly see the results that you want. So depending on how long you want to take, and you can just see again there, I just did on the helmet using the green glaze, just going over it a little bit. And this is also a technique where you can over highlight the model, so the highlights can look too bright on purpose, and then you go back up with the darker colour, just glazing in from like the edges of the highlights down into the shadows. It just knocks everything back, and it actually reinforces the colour, because by adding extra highlights you're taking away the green colour, so you're desaturating the model. So if you want to get the greens back in, it's a good sort of way to over highlight it and then glaze the colours back on. But talking about the glazes again, so I'd said about the extra watered down version making a much cleaner finish, but it takes a lot more work, and so the opposite is actually true obviously for the having a slightly thicker glaze. So if you do say 3 parts or 2 parts water even to 1 part paint, then as you apply it you will notice a difference straight away as you apply it, but it will make kind of like a paint mark on the model, whereas if you have like a very thin glaze when you apply it, you won't be able to see really the edges of where the paint goes. It just looks like a very soft, gentle touch on it, so you have to do lots and lots of glazes over it. The brush that I'm actually using for the glazing here is a size 2 D Artis Opus brush. So I've been trying out the sort of like the short bristle brushes just to see sort of what effect they are, and I actually quite like them for glazing small areas. Not so good for glazing large models, like a Primarch or Greater Demon or something like that, but if you're glazing a small area, because they're quite short fat bristles on them, it holds just enough paint for a glaze so you can cover a large area, and you can push a bit harder and it has like a wide brush stroke when you apply it. And because it's short as well, the bristles are a little bit stiffer, so you don't get like a soft kind of brush effect mark when you apply it. But it's like the differences are subtle between the different types of brushes when you're using them for glazing. But generally speaking, I much prefer having a larger brush because you can cover the area in fewer marks. Onto the additional shine spots that I was talking about earlier. So I've just applied these quite roughly actually. One on the top of the shoulder pad there, and one on the helmet, and I'm going to quickly put one on the backpack here as well. And if you notice, they're all kind of like they match, so I'm painting them all on from that one angle. So it does help to make everything look coherent as you rotate the model around. If you will paint all of the highlights on from one side, the best way to do it is probably to map everything out, and then you can spend as long or as short a time as you want blending everything together. Also, like if you were doing this sort of method for, maybe if you're painting like 5 or 10 of these or whatever, as maybe like a kill team or whatever it is, whatever game system you're using, if you only need like a handful of models, then it's not too bad actually to use this technique, and they'll look really cool on the battlefield. And so just taking a little bit of time just to quickly map out all the highlights, going all the way around, rotating the model, putting these shine spots on, so it looks good from every angle. Then you can spend as long as you want just blending the colours in. So you could see there when I said I mapped the colours on, I started straight with the 50-50 mix of Toxic Yellow and Angel Green to quickly put the blobs of highlight on. Then I'm going back with the Angel Green at the edges just to soften the transition, and it's basically just sort of stippling that I'm using. So this is even quicker really than the front sections that I was painting on. And it's just left a really nice kind of additional shine. So when you look at this from face on, it just looks like there's a shine coming on from the right hand side as you look at the model. Or like if you find also as you sort of blend these in that the Angel Green is still a little bit too light compared to the dark areas, because like I had got the shoulder pad going a little bit dark around towards the back of it, that's when the Angel Green mixed with the coal, what was it called, charcoal colour, that's when you blend in the edges of that as well. But that gives you an idea of what to do all the way around the model when painting the additional sort of shine spots on. So here I'm going to show you how to paint in the eye, and again we're going to be using exactly the same reds as I used on the gun, and those reds being the one that I can't find to tell you what the name is. Actually I found it, Nocturnal red, there we go. So I'm using 2 reds here, Nocturnal red and Scarlet red, and the base layer for the eye I've painted in with Nocturnal red. It's kind of like mixed in actually, so if you look on the wet palette, I'll go fed up and I just mix the 2 colours together, so it's sort of like darker. It's Scarlet red mixed with Nocturnal red, probably more a little bit Scarlet Red, mainly because when I was applying the Scarlet Red, it wasn't making a big enough difference to see on the model. But so all I'm doing is painting towards the front of the eye, so you cover as much of the eye as you can. You have to make sure that the whole of the eye area is painted in black first. So when you applied the greens with the stippling, you may have found that you went over some of the eye, got some of the paint in there. So paint that area black again first. So I'm just taking the red mix that I've used and painted from around about 2/3 of the way towards the back of the eye, carry the brushstrokes towards the front of the eye until you've got something that looks like a fairly opaque red around about half of the eye covered. Then you take the Scarlet Blood and you mix that with some white. So it's got a little bit pinky, and all you're going to do is paint the lower edge on the front 2/3 of the eye. Then I've got a white color. This is one color that I couldn't get for the new model color paints. Like it just wasn't in stock anywhere for finding the white. So I actually used some P3 Morrow White actually, but it doesn't matter too much. Any white will do. But all I did was put like a little white dot at the back of the eye over the area that's basically still black, and you have a very simple eye lens there. I say very simple, like it's in concept it's simple. Obviously it's not that easy to paint because it just depends on brush control and getting your paint consistency right and things like that. If you find that the front of the eye still isn't quite shiny enough for your taste, you can also take the highlight a little bit higher. So just go over the pink line that you put underneath on the lower edge of the eye lens, and just near the very front of it just add another little highlight, and that can push the contrast up a little bit on the eye then as well. Just very quickly here now, getting towards the finishing up the Marine, painting in the black areas on the gun. These I always find this kind of irritating. It's sort of like just filling in the areas that no one cares about. Probably if I had not even painted these and taken the photo, no one would even notice. So don't spend too long on this, but all you're doing is the same kind of mechanism as you used on painting the armor, sort of like that scratchy technique, starting off with the charcoal, then adding white to it each time. So I think I did like 2 additional layers, adding a little bit more white each time, so it goes a bit lighter, and each time that you add another layer, the area that you apply it to becomes smaller, so you can still see the previous layers at the edges. And you can see there I'm not even bothering doing a straight line or anything on the whatever part of the gun that is, probably some sort of range finding laser tagging device thing. But all it is so I've painted like a highlight line down, which again, like if you hold the model under a lamp, you'll see that the light catches that sort of long cylindrical shape going down there, and then the stock of the gun down here, there's a little bit of edge highlighting just to pick out some details, a bit scratchy towards the bottom. This is so for areas like this, what you'll find is like light probably won't get that far down into the model because it's in a sort of a deep recess. Or if it does, it just looks like a sort of an even area that the light falls on. So it's not that easy to figure out the way that I've painted it, but that's because I've just made it up. So it's basically I've just done a transition, like a soft transition, going from dark to light at the base of the gun, just to fill in the area. Really, it's not super realistic, but it just gives you a little bit of sort of interest on the model. Back to the reds here again. I'm using the Scarlet Blood, just to quickly go around picking out the edge highlights, not being super neat, and again doing the same technique as I've used on the armor, but using that sort of it's called modulation, so it's just light next to dark, filling in like the flat surface. So like it doesn't look that wrong, but it's not accurate in terms of realistic lighting, but it just helps to kind of like fill in the space. And then I'm taking up the highlights on this as well, just a little bit lighter. So this is the Scarlet Blood mixed with a little bit of white to get that sort of pinky colour. and because the Nocturnal red is quite a dark red, so that's what you can see in sort of like the darker areas on it, and you can almost see a bit of the primer showing through as well. So it gives like a kind of quite a high contrast look to the red. A bit pinky with the white added on, a little bit almost purpley from the Nocturnal red. If you find that you want like a stronger, more vibrant red, then you can just glaze in the Scarlet blood back on top of it, and that'll sort of like punch up the saturation a bit more. And if you are going to do that, remember that you can over highlight it. So if you want to paint on some scratches on there, or anything like that, paint those on first and then glaze over it with the Scarlet blood, and that'll soften them down a bit. And then if you actually want to take it a step further, once you've glazed it over the top, you can then go over it again with the bright the Scarlet blood mixed with white, so that for the pinky color, just put like a little dot or whatever on one of the scratches, and it just gives it sort of a little bit of a bling, like light's catching it. So you can see there I'm just doing some very fine scratches and things, and actually some of the scratches that I put on there are a bit finer than the ones that I put on the armour. It just helps to differentiate the surface materials that you're painting on as well. It makes it look a bit more interesting. Not really looking for that much realism on this. It's kind of like a quick model that I'm painting, so but just to make it a bit interesting to look at. One thing that I did miss actually when I was painting the armour, I did take the final highlight on the armour up to the toxic yellow, which is the little dots that you can see. So if you look on the shoulder pad or on the helmet, top of the helmet, I've just painted in a little dot right in the centre of the highlights. It just helps to give it that sort of bling look to it. The lens that I painted on here is quite a simple process again. So I'm using turquoise. I've mixed a few colours in here. So it's turquoise mixed with charcoal for the bottom sort of grubby blue colour. Next to that, to the left, that is just turquoise from the pot mixed with a bit of water. Then after that I switch over to Aquamarine, which is basically just turquoise mixed with a bit of white, but I have the colours anyway. And then I actually add white on its own to, if you look on the top section of the wet palette there. And for how I'm applying it, it's pretty much just like a circle going all the way around, but sort of squashed in a bit, so you can leave the middle kind of area a bit darker, almost like just so it's just the primer showing. You can see there I just added a bit of black to the turquoise mixed with the charcoal, so I'm actually making it even darker just to get the to help blend in the middle bit, because I found that the tonal jump between the colour that I'd mixed and the black primer was just a little bit too high, so you could see the step in between. So I just mixed a slightly darker colour just to neaten it up a bit. And so as I said, you're basically just doing sort of rough circles that are a little bit squashed in, and then on the top left I'm painting a specular highlight. And so a lot of people, when they do this, they just paint a white dot in the same way that I did with the lens actually on the for the eyes on the Marine. I just did a white dot in the corner. It's a very small area though, so a white dot looks fine. For these bigger lenses, I like to put a transition on them, and it kind of depends on the surface material. Like if you wanted a really glossy look to it, then going straight white is probably going to be the most effective look for putting that dot on at the top left. It doesn't have to be a circle, by the way. If you get like a really shiny object and you're in a room with windows and you see the reflection on the shiny object, like the light hitting it, it'll be like a square because the light coming in through the windows is square. The shape is very much dependent on the source of the light that's hitting the thing. So if you wanted to do like a cloudy sky reflection on there or whatever, you could paint like wobbly kind of light reflection shapes on there, but it's just very easy to paint a circular dot. But as I was saying, so for this, the glass I'm painting on this is slightly, I say frosted or something like that. I just think it looks a bit more interesting than having like a straight white dot on the top left. So you can see a bit of the transition colours going all the way around. and it can, it can represent anything, whatever, who cares, but I just like the look of it. It's entirely up to you on how you want to achieve the look, but that's and I've done the same thing on the other two sort of lenses on the gun, and the red lenses also on the targeting thingy on his shoulder, on his backpack. Sorry, you can see I did those with the same reds that I did on the gun. It's all the same kind of technique, same colours, so pretty straightforward. And that's pretty much it. The only thing I haven't shown you how to paint really is the belt, and that was done with some grunge brown, I think it was, and Gorgon brown, and no, I was white, right? grunge brown and orange fire, and it was just like a couple of lines painted on very, very quickly, just to get a bit of texture on there. So and finally, the very last thing that I didn't show you how to do was the base, and all that was PVA, glue sand on, wait for that to dry, give it a wash of Agrax Earthshade. When that's dry, I just covered it in weathering powder. Use whatever weathering powder you want. I didn't even bother to seal the weathering powder because I don't touch my the flat areas of the bases, so if you just pick it up by the rim, you won't have a problem. The only thing you have to watch out for if you don't seal the weathering powder is if you get water or like a wet substance on the base, then it can lift the weathering powder off. But unless you're like playing outside in the rain, I don't think again that's that much of an issue. But that's pretty much it. That's how to paint one of the new Desolation Marines. I probably will paint another Dark Angel Marine and try and get the process a bit quicker so that it can fit in with the other Marines that I've done, so like an hour or so per Marine, because this one took a little bit longer just because of the technique that I've used on the armour. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. I have endless things I have to paint still to go up on videos, and also don't forget that I have my Patreon and my own personal website, which are chock-a-block full of hundreds of tutorials on like how to do all the painting that I normally do, which is more sort of like high-end Golden Demon type stuff. But anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.